And here we go. We're going to finish up today with ecology. And I want to start with something that I had probably should have finished up with yesterday and didn't quite get to. We were talking about niches. Let me see, am I present? Okay, I am presenting, great. We were talking about niches. And this is important because if you are a beekeeper, I'm kidding. You can define a niche as the set of all conditions under which it'll grow. And whenever members of any two populations have niches that overlap, what we have is competition. The example that I gave are local hardware stores or something like that. Okay, welcome. We're just starting. Wait, did you make it on? Okay, here we go. Right. Okay, I'm still presenting. Okay. If you go to a garden store and pick up a plant, there'll be a tag on the plant with preferred growing conditions. You know, some plants will prefer full sun, others partial sun, some tolerate shade, some require lots of water, some are drought resistant. Some varieties of tomato are bred to be, you know, pest resistant, others not so much. All of those conditions that you get on the plant tag make up that plant's niche. And there's a difference between the fundamental niche, which is where a species can grow, and the realized niche, which is where it does grow, given the fact that there's competition. Now, we mentioned last time that if two species share exactly the same niche, one will drive the other to extinction. On the other hand, what often happens is that the species will evolve in such a way that they'll end up sharing the niche. And we call that niche partitioning. The example I gave was, suppose you woke up one morning and found that there were 20 shoe stores that had all simultaneously opened up in Valonia. Well, some of them would not be able to compete. You know, they wouldn't get any customers and they'd end up going out of business. Others of them might be able to survive, but what they do is what I think they call market segmentation in business, meaning they would okay, sorry, I'm just checking to, okay, right, sorry, I'm getting some messages. Meaning that they might specialize, that one store might specialize in, you know, work boots, and one might specialize in athletic shoes, and one might specialize in, you know, high-end, you know, fancy footwear or something like that. That's called niche partitioning when it happens in ecology. Let me show you one thing about the difference between a fundamental niche and a realized niche. These are some classic studies that were done on the coast of the Pacific Northwest, you know, up in Washington State. The coastline there, a lot of it is rocky, and two species of critters called barnacles live on rocky coast in the Pacific Northwest. Barnacles are actually related to shrimp and crabs. They're crustaceans. As adults, though, their anatomy gets modified and they live with their heads permanently attached to rocks and grow these shells around them that makes them look more like volcanoes than anything else. This is a bunch of them, a bunch of little volcano-like things growing on a rock. There is a large species, it's genus Balanus. I can't remember what the species name is, but it's not critical here. And a smaller species called Cathamalus. And again, that's Cathamalus something us because we use binomial names. I don't remember what the species name is, but it's not crucial for our point of view right now. So we have two species, one genus Balanus and one in the genus Cathamalus. Here's the thing, the competition here is for space because barnacles, once they're adults, can't move. They are permanently attached to the rocks that they grow up on, meaning that, you know, if a baby barnacle is trying to settle down and there's no space for it, then it will just eventually die. You know, real estate on a crowded rock can be harder to get than a decent apartment in San Francisco. Where both of them live together, Balanus, the big one, okay, Balanus balanoides, outcompetes Cathamalus. Balanus is big enough that it can grow right over the top of Cathamalus. However, Cathamalus can survive for a longer period of time out of the water. These rocks are right at the ocean level, and because of the tides, you have several zones. The rocks in the lower intertidal zone are wet most of the time. The rocks in the upper intertidal zone may be high and dry, except for a couple of times a day when the water level is high enough. So upper intertidal dries out a lot. Lower intertidal doesn't. Both of those species can live in all of those zones, in all of those rocks from the upper to the lower. Balanus outcompetes Cathamalus, but in the upper zone, Cathamalus can live and Balanus can't. So the idea is that Cathamalus's fundamental niche would be the upper and the middle zones. That's where it can live. But the realized niche is only the upper zone because that's where it does live. That's the only place where it's capable of living. So that's the difference between a fundamental niche and a realized niche. Competition keeps Cathamalus out of the middle, even though it could live there quite happily if it weren't for Balanus. Okay. If you watch an ecosystem over a longish period of time, what you see is a process called ecological succession. And you could see this in a plowed field or a vacant lot or a house lawn that doesn't get mowed. You could see this. Imagine you've got just a plot of bare soil, you know, a vacant lot or a field or what have you, and it's been completely abandoned. Well, weed seeds will drift in. You get dandelion seeds and whatnot. So first you'll start seeing small weeds growing there. If you give it more time, maybe about a year, you'll begin to see tall grasses growing there. It'll get, you know, thicker and more brushy. Give it a few years and shrubs are going to start coming in. So you're going to get more underbrush and, you know, bush that you have to bush hog your way through. Given a few more years and you'll begin to see trees getting taller and taller. And the trees, of course, will get larger and larger. And if you give it a really long time, a couple of centuries, you end up with forest that shades out the underbrush. You end up with tall trees that block so much light that not much can grow underneath them. That's an example of ecological succession, and it might take centuries to see the entire process, but you know, the beginnings of it you've probably seen, you know, in any, you know, vacant lots or, you know, construction site or anything like that in your own neighborhoods. Similar things would happen in other ecosystems. You could see this in the oceans, for example. One place you could see this, and people have seen this, is on man-made objects like boat piers and pilings and any kind of structure built in the ocean. Offshore oil rigs get this. You'll have first a few species of animal will start living on the human-made structure, and then more will come, and then more will come, and you'll get a series of communities over time. And eventually, the ecosystem is dominated by a climax community, which is basically the end of the line. This is a picture was taken in a beautiful place that I've visited, Muir Woods, California. This is a climax community of a type called old growth forest. The place is dominated by giant redwood trees that get up over 300 feet, about 100 meters. They're huge. This is not the place where you can drive through the trunk of one of them, or you used to be able to. This is not that place, but some of the trees are big enough that you could almost do that. And this is an example of a climax community. There's no underbrush because the redwoods throw so much shade that not much else can grow under them in their shade. And that's pretty much where ecological succession comes to an end, once it's dominated by this climax community that's taken hundreds of years to reach this state. And we can watch this happen in real time, and this is a great example of it. We can distinguish between primary and secondary succession. And in primary succession, it's happening on a location where there's never been any life. What you're looking at is an aerial photo of Surtsey. This was an undersea volcano that erupted in 1963 and put out so much lava and so much ash that it actually broke the surface and formed a small island off the coast of Iceland. Again, in the year 1963, people were around to watch this happen. So there's Surtsey in the process of erupting. Means island of the fire giant, by the way. And when Surtsey arose, it was practically sterile. There are Archeans that can live in pretty hot temperatures, but I don't know of anything that can live in actual molten lava. So that steaming volcanic rock being formed right there in front of your eyes is practically sterile, as close to it as you're going to get. So there's no life on Surtsey when it formed. Surtsey is actually off limits to most people. Scientists visit it every year, and what they've been able to do is track what's happened to it, because you have things like seabirds that will started nesting on Surtsey as soon as the rock cooled down. Seabirds, of course, poop on things, so their droppings have gotten mixed in with the volcanic ash and started creating soil. Many plants have wind-blown seeds, dandelions and things like that, that can be carried across the ocean. You get other living things that can blow over there in storms, small insects and spiders and things. They documented a case of a tree that fell over in a storm and drifted to Surtsey that still had a big ball of soil surrounding its roots. So that introduced earthworms, and also it introduced more plants and bugs and things like that. And here's what Surtsey looks like today. It's gone from being completely barren to over 60 species of plants. There are seabirds, there are marine mammals, seals, Um, Other birds, which of course can fly from the nearest land, insects, slugs, seaweeds, and marine life now lives on the rocky shores. And it got there mostly by dispersing from the mainland of Iceland. And so we're seeing changes in the ecosystem over time as new species disperse in, and as species thrive for a while and then sometimes get outcompeted by something else. The communities of plants and animals on Surtsey are subject to change. So that would be primary succession in a place that never held any life. Secondary succession would involve succession in a region that's been disturbed but has never been sterile. This is just an abandoned farm field, and you can see it's growing a lot of, looks like goldenrod. This used to be plowed. It used to be where the family grew wheat or whatever it is that they grew. So it was always being disturbed every year by plowing and then by harvesting, but it's never been sterilized, right? The place was never nuked or anything like that. So there's always been life in the area. And the process of succession is a little bit different. General rule is that our selected species are often the first to appear. Now remember that our selected species are the ones that maximize quantity over quality in reproducing. They produce very large numbers of offspring, but don't invest a great deal in each one. Our selected plant species tend to be weeds. All right, they grow fast. They crank out lots of seeds. They're always putting seeds out, and most of them might die, but a few of them might get lucky, and they'll be able to spread rapidly into a disturbed area. Given time, the R-selected species eventually get replaced by more K-selected species, which tend to grow more slowly, not produce as many offspring, but put more energy into each offspring that they do produce. And there are some ecosystems, and this, by the way, is one of them, and so was the one on the previous slide. Repeated disturbances keep the community from continuing ecological succession. And a great example of this is prairie. Most of the prairie in Arkansas has been plowed up for agriculture. There's little strips of it remaining alongside places like railroad rights of way. There's a little bit of prairie remaining on the UCA campus. That's the main attraction at the Jewel Moore Nature Reserve, as you'll see either live or on the videos that you'll look at as part of the last lab that we do. Prairie has, very diverse communities of plants, many of them quite beautiful, in fact. And the thing about prairies is that they're periodically subject to fire. We actually deliberately burn the Jewel Moore Nature Reserve prairie every couple of years. In a natural state, prairies would be set on fire by, lightning from summer storms or things like that. In some areas, prairies were deliberately set on fire by Native Americans. This is a controlled prairie burn that's been deliberately set by managers. And the reason why this is important is if you took a piece of prairie and you just simply left it alone, well, first you'd get those grasses and those flowers, but eventually seeds from trees would start spreading in. They might get carried in by squirrels or something. They might blow in. They might get washed in. One way or another, they would get into the prairie and they'd start growing there. And given enough time, they would shade out the flowers and the grasses, and they'd end up forming forest where the prairie used to be. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but today, if you want to maintain prairie, you periodically have to burn it off to keep it from becoming forest. You're basically stopping ecological succession and resetting it back to where it was. So, and incidentally, a lot of prairie species can come back from a fire pretty quickly. Some of them have fire-resistant seeds. Some of them can come back fast from fire-resistant roots. Some can just spread very quickly into burned areas from areas that haven't burned. They can spread from an unburned patch into a burned patch. So plants that live in prairies are pretty well adapted to come back. They have adapted to an environment that burns off every few years. This is one that I remember well from when I was a graduate student at the University of California in the People's Republic of Berkeley. This is what the Central California hills look like when they're not getting built over to form soulless suburbs for Silicon Valley. This is a ecosystem called chaparral, I guess. And you have a mixture of grasses and shrubs, things like bearberry and things like that, and some kind of smallish oaks and pines and junipers and things like that. There's a lot of smallish live oaks that live in here. You can have pines in some areas, and this is pretty much the view in the hills of Southern and Central California. This is what you would see. Chaparral is also adapted to burn periodically. If you simply left it alone, it might end up as forest. But wildfires do periodically happen and always have. And many of the species of chaparral can come back very quickly. Some of them just sprout right back from the roots. You can burn the top of the plant completely, and the roots will just pop something right back. Some of them have seeds that can withstand fire. Others will just drift in to a burn patch from a patch that isn't burned. So the chaparral actually does fairly well in the aftermath of a fire. The reason this was a problem was my first year at grad school in 1991. I was living less than a mile away from this. What had happened was the hills overlooking Berkeley were all chaparral, and then people started building houses on them, many of them after about the year 1900. And obviously you don't want to have wildfires around your house. So what people had been doing was suppressing the wildfires that would naturally go through the chaparral. The end result was that dead vegetation builds up. Dead leaves, dead pine needles, dead twigs and branches and things like that. Those weren't burning off. So they were building up, on the forest floor and in the soil. And eventually they ended up as fuel for a fire in 1991 that killed 25 people, destroyed over 3,000 homes. If you're a baseball fan, you should look this up because there was so much smoke coming from the Oakland Hills that it actually disrupted I think it might have been the World Series. There was a game going on that I think they had to cancel because so much smoke was drifting into Candlestick Park or 3Com Park or whatever it is now, the one in San Francisco. So that was a case where we blocked the periodic burning of chaparral, and it ended up having dire consequences. Now, while it might be, from one point of view, it might be nice to just let the land go back to what it's supposed to be. People still did want to live up there, but they've taken much more stringent precautions to try to keep dead vegetation from building up. One of the things the city of Oakland now has is a herd of goats that goes around grazing vegetation, keeping it from building up to high levels. So, yeah, Goats. Okay, right. If you think about an ecosystem, you can classify the living things in it not by species and genus and all of that, but by what they do, by what their roles are. And we can talk about producers, which take in carbon dioxide gas and use sunlight and produce what we call biomass. Biomass is just matter that is living. You're made of biomass. The trees outside are made of biomass. It just means, life considered as material stuff. And biomass gets made by the organisms that do, in all the ecosystems you would be familiar with, biomass is created by the living things that do photosynthesis, the plants and the photosynthetic protists and things like that. And critters that do that we call the producers. I think the slide says productors. That's a typo. And then you have organisms that eat the plants directly, and those would be consumers, specifically primary consumers, because they feed on the producers directly. So the grass on my lawn would be a primary producer. The grasshoppers that eat the grass would be the primary consumers. Simple so far. Whatever eats the primary consumers would be the secondary consumers. So the grass on my lawn would be the primary producers, the grasshoppers, the primary consumers, and then the mice that eat the grasshoppers would be secondary consumers. And then the cats that eat the mice, or more usually dismember them horribly and leave them on the front door. But okay, if they eat them, they'd be secondary consumers. Sorry, tertiary consumers, because they're feeding on the secondary consumers, the mice, which are feeding on the primary consumers, which was the grasshoppers, which are feeding on the primary producers. And then we could keep going. The quaternary consumers would be what we call anything that ate the tertiary consumers. So if the red-shouldered hawks actually swooped down and ate one of my cats, they would be quaternary consumers. So we can define these things in an ecosystem that we call trophic levels. Trophane is Greek for to feed. You might remember we used the words autotrophs and heterotrophs way back at the beginning. So the same root gives rise to trophic levels. Now, some ecosystems may not have exactly this many trophic levels. In the ocean, there are some ecosystems that might have as many as 9 and as few as 2. Not all ecosystems have exactly 1 level of primary producers and then 4 levels of consumers. And then, of course, many organisms might occupy several levels at once. Humans, for example, since we eat both plants and animals, we could be both primary and secondary consumers, and possibly even higher level consumers as well. Even just within one meal, we're probably eating on several levels at once. So this is a bit of a simplification, but it will do to get some points across. So what consumers are doing is transferring biomass from one trophic level to the next. So here's a panda eating bamboo. And the bamboo is, of course, the primary consumer, because the bamboo is taking carbon dioxide gas and water and a few nutrients through the roots and converting them into more bamboo, right? Converting it into bamboo biomass. And then when the panda eats the panda takes some of that bamboo's biomass and turns it into panda biomass. right? Some of that bamboo ends up becoming more panda, right? The panda grows and gets bigger and it gains weight. There's more panda biomass there than there used to be. So the panda has transferred biomass from the bamboo to itself. And then if somebody eats the panda, don't know if that would taste very good, but if someone eats the panda, then biomass would get transferred from the bamboo to the predator. If a tiger maybe eats, I don't know, if the tiger eats the panda, then the panda biomass, some of it would become tiger biomass. The same is true of energy, because remember, energy is stored in chemical bonds, and you've got this way to take the chemical energy that was stored in the molecules that made up your food and convert it into chemical energy in the form of this stuff called ATP that powers your metabolism and enables you to do what you do, right? You get energy from food. So you can think of energy as also being transferred from one trophic level to the next. You could think of the bamboo as storing solar energy, and then when the panda eats the bamboo, some of that energy that used to be solar energy is turned into the energy that runs the panda's own metabolism, and so on. So biomass and energy are constantly moving from one trophic level to the next. And the story doesn't end there. There's a whole nother group of organisms that we call decomposers. These happen to be bracket fungi or shelf fungi growing on a dead tree stump. The shelves that you see are fruiting bodies, which you might remember if you remember fungi. Those are the reproductive structures, but the actual fungus, most of it is growing through that dead wood of the tree stump in the form of those little filaments, if you remember hyphae. And they're growing. Those hyphae are very slowly breaking down the dead wood, making it crumbly. If you've ever handled rotten wood, you might have noticed that it starts getting kind of powdery and punky and easy to break apart. That's the action of the fungal hyphae, which can digest wood. There's probably bacteria in there as well doing the same thing. And decomposers, and fungi are classically very good decomposers, break down dead organisms, and ultimately the atoms that make up those dead organisms get recycled. And we'll talk about how they cycle in just a bit. So the biomass and energy that used to be in that tree is ultimately going to become parts of these fungi, and the fungi themselves will eventually get broken down, and eventually everything gets eaten by something else, and all of those atoms get cycled from producers to consumers, and ultimately everything ends up in the decomposers. And then from there, it may pass to new generations of producers. So, yeah, everything gets cycled. That's kind of the big idea for today and for the next hour, is cycles of life. Right. There's, on the left of this diagram, you've got typical organisms on various trophic levels in a prairie. The primary producers might be the plants. The primary consumers, there's a grasshopper eating one of the plants. If you have a mouse eating a grasshopper, the mouse would be a secondary consumer. Let's say you have a rattlesnake eating the mouse, that would make a tertiary consumer. And there's a red-tailed hawk eating the rattlesnake, that would be a quaternary consumer. On the right, there's what it would look like in the ocean. The primary producers are mostly single-celled protists and bacteria, little green algae floating around. Those get eaten by what we call zooplankton, which are little nearly microscopic shrimps and fish larvae and other critters like that. Those would get eaten by fairly small fish, which would be the secondary consumers. And I think those are, I don't know, those might be sardines as the secondary consumers eating the little shrimpy things. And then your tertiary consumer right there, what they've drawn in, that's what a tuna looks like, which would eat the small fish. And then the quaternary consumer here would be an orca, which eats absolutely anything it wants to. Okay. Imagine you could take the amount of biomass at each level and represent it as a bar. You could then draw this trophic relationships as a set of bars stacked one on top of the other, and you end up with a diagram called a trophic pyramid. So let's say we could take a piece of prairie. Imagine that we could vacuum up every living thing on that patch of prairie and sort every living thing by its ecological role and weigh them all. We might find that a patch of prairie might have, I'm just going to kind of make something up, it might have 100,000 pounds of plants. Okay. What you would find is that if you could weigh all of the primary consumers that eat the plants, all of the bugs that feed on the plants, you'd get roughly 10,000 pounds of bugs. And then if you could weigh all of the little rats that eat the bugs, all the little rodents and things like that, and maybe the predatory insects like dragonflies too, if you could weigh all the secondary consumers, you'd get roughly 1,000 pounds of those. And then if you weighed all of the tertiary consumers, you know, the snakes that eat the mice, you'd get maybe, 100 pounds of those. And the quaternary consumers would make up maybe about 10 pounds of those. So you need 100,000 pounds of grasses to support about 10,000 pounds of bugs, to support about 1,000 pounds of mice, to support about 100 pounds worth of snakes, to support about 10 pounds worth of red-tailed hawks, let's say. If we go back to the trophic levels in a prairie ecosystem that are diagrammed over there on the left. And a diagram that shows how those bars are stacked together is called a trophic pyramid. And the reason why you see that is you lose energy and biomass every time you move up a trophic level. Most of the matter that a consumer eats doesn't go into building new biomass. For one thing, metabolism is not 100% efficient. You don't get 100% of the energy that's present in your food. You end up maybe getting, I want to say 30%. It's not possible, far as I know, for a metabolism to be much more efficient than that. Some of your biomass is lost as waste that you don't digest. And a lot of the energy that you get from your food, in the case of mammals, it goes into keeping them warm, and ultimately it radiates out into space in the form of body heat. A lot of it may also be used just for repair and maintenance instead of new growth. So, you know, you eat something on the order of, I mean, a meal is typically maybe a pound of food. So you might eat 2 or 3 pounds of food a day, but you don't gain 2 or 3 pounds of weight in a day. Sometimes it seems that way, but you don't really, because most of the energy and biomass that you eat do not ultimately go on to building more you. And what we call the ecological efficiency of each trophic level is the proportion of biomass at a lower level that ends up permanently within a higher level, and it averages roughly 10%. In real life, it varies a bit, but 10% is the rule of thumb. So that's why I was saying it would take 100,000 pounds of plant life to sustain about 10,000 pounds of bug life, to sustain about 1,000 pounds of mouse, to sustain about 100 pounds worth of rattlesnakes, which would sustain 10 pounds, maybe 2 red-tailed hawks. You actually get this in agriculture as well. It would take you very roughly 5,000 pounds of feed to raise a calf to a weight of 500 pounds. I think for calves, it might be a little more than that. For pigs, it would be a little less. You know, the 10% is a very rough rule of thumb, and it's different for different animals and even different breeds, but 10% is pretty close. That's the fraction of biomass at a lower level that ends up within a higher level. So here's one drawn for a piece of the ocean. It might take 1 million kilograms of phytoplankton, those little single-celled algae drifting around, to sustain 100,000 kilos of little shrimp, the zooplankton, to sustain 10,000 pounds of lower-level carnivores, to 10,000 kilos, to sustain 1,000 kilos of large fish, to sustain 100-kilogram great white shark. So each step of that trophic pyramid is only about 1/10 the size of the level below. I'm not going to tell anybody what they ought to eat. I'm the last person who should do that, and it's not my job. One of the arguments for adopting a vegetarian diet is you can feed more people. Most of the beef that you eat these days is fed on corn, and it might take 5,000 pounds of corn to raise a calf to give you 500 pounds of meat. You could feed more people if you just fed the corn to the people instead of feeding it to the cow and then fed the cow to the people. It's not as simple as that, but it is probably true that if everybody adopted a vegetarian diet, we could feed more people just by eating lower on that trophic pyramid. You know, we'd certainly get more, more raw weight of food. Of course, it might not be hamburgers, but as far as just pounds of food that we could produce, that would work, and this is why. Another reason you might actually need to know this stuff is something called biological magnification. There's a number of chemicals in the environment, some of them natural and some of them not, that organisms can't easily break down and can't easily excrete. One of them is an herbicide an insect pest killer, a pesticide called DDT, dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane. It's okay, we can just say DDT. DDT was heavily used in the 50s to control mosquito populations. One of the reasons it's not still used is that mosquitoes developed resistance by natural selection, which we talked about way back in the evolution part of the course, about the beginning of the second week. The other problem is that DDT builds up in living tissue. Most organisms can't break it down. Most of them can't eliminate it, so it just kind of hangs around, mostly in your fat. DDT washing into pond water, for example, or lake water, might wash in at an extremely small concentration. If you can see the slide, it says 0.000003 parts per million. Okay, percent is parts per 100. This is 0.000003 parts per million. So what? That is a million. A part per million is what? 1/100. Come on, Wagoner. 1/10,000th of a percent. And the amount of DDT in pond water is a tiny fraction of that. The problem is that algae, right, the little green scum things living in the water, take up DDT. And every little shrimpy thing, every one of those little shrimps in the zooplankton might eat thousands of algae in its life, and the DDT will build up in them because they can't break down the DDT and they can't poop out the DDT. So the concentration in the zooplankton is over 1,000 times greater because every zooplankton eats thousands of little algae. Every tiny little shrimp eats hundreds of, every tiny fish would eat hundreds of tiny little shrimp. And so the small fish end up with over 100 times as much DDT, over 10 times, misread that, because every little fish is eating dozens of little shrimp. And then every big fish is eating dozens of little fish. And then every fish-eating bird, notably bald eagles and ospreys, is eating dozens of large fish. And at every step, the concentration of DDT gets greater because every individual on one level has to eat many individuals at the lower level and builds up DNA because, DDT, not DNA, DDT, because they can't get rid of it and they can't break it down. And by the time you have that concentration of DDT in fish-eating birds, it starts having a bad effect. It makes it, the birds are no longer able to make strong eggshells. So they're laying eggs that crack as soon as they're laid. DDT is a reason why the bald eagle, when I was a kid, was endangered in all of the states except for Alaska. The bald eagles made a remarkable comeback, and now we can see them in Arkansas. Some years they nest in trees around Lake Conway. I've seen them up in the Ozarks as well. So the bald eagles are recovering. But we almost managed to wipe out our own national symbol from the use of DDT, coupled with this phenomenon of biological magnification. The higher up you go on that trophic pyramid, the greater the concentration of certain chemicals that can't be broken down or excreted. This is also the reason why the US government currently advises pregnant and nursing women and young children not to eat shark or swordfish and limit their consumption of tuna. That's a tuna in that picture. And tunas are fast attack predators. They're very fast swimmers and they're really big. You might not know it if your only experience with tuna is those little cans, but things like bluefin tuna are very large fish, and they're very fast swimming fish, and they are predators. They're up very high on the trophic pyramid. And mercury is a problem here. There's mercury in the oceans. Some of it is a pollutant caused by burning coal. Some of it's there naturally. There's some mercury all the time. And that gets taken up by the single-celled algae, the little green things in the ocean. And then every tiny shrimpy thing eats thousands of little algae. And then every small fish eats thousands of little shrimpies. And then every big fish eats hundreds of little fish. And then every bigger fish eats hundreds of big fish. And then every tuna eats, I don't know, dozens of big fish. And nobody can get rid of the mercury, so it tends to pile up. And mercury is very bad, especially for developing fetuses and very young children. Mercury poisoning can mess with brain development. And that's why pregnant and nursing women are advised not to eat shark or swordfish, because those are up at the top of the trophic pyramid, and so are tuna. So if you're pregnant or nursing or you're a baby, don't eat shark, don't eat swordfish, limit your tuna, because those are the likeliest to contain mercury levels that are high enough that they could be dangerous. Okay, right. That's actually a pretty good place to pause. I've got 10:07. We will reconvene at click. Let's make it 10:20. So I will pause from presenting and pause from recording, and I will see you back here at